For years, the town of East Lansing, Michigan, was known for discipline, achievement, and quiet pride. At the heart of that reputation stood Michigan State University, a respected institution where young athletes trained, dreamed, and trusted the adults who guided them. Among those adults was a man whose name carried authority and reassurance, Larry Nassar. To parents, he was a doctor. To coaches, he was an expert. To young gymnasts, he was someone they were told to trust without question. Behind closed doors, that trust became a weapon. Larry Nassar served as a team doctor for USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University for decades. His role granted him extraordinary access to some of the most vulnerable athletes in the country, girls often no older than 12, separated from their families, conditioned to obey authority, and taught that pain was simply part of success. What Nassar did during those years would later be recognized as one of the largest sexual abuse scandals in American sports history. But for a long time, no one stopped him. Nassar disguised his abuse as medical treatment. He told athletes that his methods were legitimate, specialized procedures necessary to relieve pain, speed recovery, or prevent injury. He spoke in medical terminology, used calm tones, and relied on the unquestioned respect given to doctors. Many victims were told that what felt wrong was simply uncomfortable therapy, and when some girls did speak up, they weren't believed. Complaints were minimized. Concerns were deflected. In some cases, victims were made to feel embarrassed or confused, unsure whether what they experienced even qualified as abuse. The system around Nassar universities, athletic organizations, and governing bodies failed to connect the dots. Or worse, chose not to look. Internal reports later revealed that warnings had surfaced years before his arrest. Parents raised alarms. Athletes expressed discomfort. Administrators received reports that something was off. Yet investigations were slow, fragmented, or quietly closed. Nassar continued working, continuing to see patients, continuing to harm. For Michigan, this was not just a crime. It was a collapse of trust. The silence finally broke when several survivors came forward publicly, refusing to be dismissed any longer. Their stories shared disturbing similarities, the same techniques, the same justifications, the same abuse repeated again and again across different locations and years. Once the wall cracked, it shattered. More than 300 women and girls eventually came forward, Olympic champions, collegiate athletes, teenagers who had once believed they were alone. Each testimony added weight to the truth. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. In 2017, Larry Nassar was arrested and charged with multiple counts of criminal sexual conduct. He later pleaded guilty. The courtroom became a place not just of judgment, but of reckoning. During sentencing, the judge allowed victims to speak. What followed was unprecedented. One by one, survivors stood before the man who had abused them not with fear, but with clarity. They described the long-term damage, anxiety, broken trust, shame, self-blame, and years of silence. Many spoke of how authority figures had failed them, how institutions had protected reputations instead of children. The courtroom listened. Michigan listened. The nation listened. Nassar was sentenced to multiple consecutive prison terms, effectively ensuring he would die behind bars. But for many survivors, the sentence was not the end of the story. The real question remained: how had this been allowed to happen for so long? Investigations expanded beyond Nassar himself. Michigan State University faced lawsuits and public outrage. USA Gymnastics was criticized for its handling of complaints and eventually filed for bankruptcy. Careers ended. Reputations collapsed. Entire systems were forced into scrutiny. In Michigan, the case became a symbol of institutional failure, a reminder that abuse often survives not because it is invisible, but because it is ignored. Parents began questioning safeguards. Athletes spoke more openly. Policies were rewritten. Training protocols changed. But for many survivors, reform came too late. The damage had already been done. Larry Nassar did not act alone in a vacuum. He operated within a system that trusted credentials over voices, authority over vulnerability, a system that believed medals mattered more than discomfort, and silence was easier than accountability. This case reshaped how America views youth sports, medical authority, and institutional responsibility. It forced a painful acknowledgement. Predators do not always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like professionals. For Michigan, This was the case that shattered illusions, not because abuse existed, but because it was allowed to continue. And long after the courtroom emptied, the echoes of those testimonies still linger, a reminder that justice, when delayed, leaves scars that never fully fade. For generations, the University of Michigan represented excellence, a place where students arrived full of ambition, trusting that the institution would protect them as they pursued their futures. Behind its reputation, however, a disturbing truth had been quietly buried for decades. At the center of that truth was Robert Anderson, a physician employed by the university from the 1960s through the early 2000s. To students, he was simply Dr. Anderson. To administrators, he was a long-serving medical professional. To victims, he became a symbol of betrayal. For more than 30 years, Anderson allegedly sexually abused students under the guise of medical examinations. Many of those students were young men, some away from home for the first time, unsure of their rights, conditioned to trust authority figures without question. The abuse followed a familiar pattern. Students were sent to Anderson for routine physicals or minor health issues. Once inside the examination room, boundaries blurred. Procedures extended beyond what was necessary. Touch crossed into violation. And when students felt uncomfortable, many told themselves they must be misunderstanding something. After all, this was a doctor. This was a prestigious university. Surely, something like this couldn't be happening. But it was. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not only the length of time Anderson was allowed to operate, but how frequently concerns were raised and ignored. Internal records and later investigations revealed that complaints about Anderson had been made as early as the 1970s. Students told staff members, colleagues raised red flags. Warnings circulated quietly within the system. Yet Anderson remained employed. For years, the university failed to take decisive action. Investigations, when they occurred, were limited in scope. Some complaints were dismissed as misunderstandings, others were quietly filed away. The institution's priority, critics would later argue, seemed to be protecting its reputation rather than confronting a deeply uncomfortable reality. Anderson retired in 2003. He died in 2008. For many, that would have been the end of the story. But silence has a way of breaking. In 2020, former students began coming forward publicly. Their accounts, separated by decades, shared striking similarities. The same behaviors, the same justifications, the same feelings of confusion and shame. Many said they had carried the experience with them for years, unsure whether anyone would believe them. As more voices emerged, the scale of the abuse became impossible to ignore. Eventually, hundreds of alleged victims came forward. Lawsuits were filed. The university commissioned an independent investigation. The findings were devastating. The institution had failed repeatedly to act on credible complaints. Michigan watched as a pattern of institutional neglect unfolded. Survivors spoke of long-term psychological damage, trust issues, anxiety, anger, and a sense of betrayal that extended beyond Anderson himself. For many, the deeper wound was knowing that the university had been warned and chose inaction. In response to mounting pressure, the University of Michigan issued public apologies and established a settlement fund. In 2022, the university agreed to a substantial financial settlement with survivors, an acknowledgement, at least legally, of responsibility. But money could not return what had been taken. Administrators faced criticism for how the case had been handled across multiple leadership eras. The abuse had spanned decades, meaning responsibility was shared by many who either dismissed concerns or failed to follow through. Once again, Michigan found itself confronting a familiar question: how many people had to know before someone acted? This case echoed themes already seen in other large-scale abuse scandals. Power imbalances, blind trust in credentials, a culture that discouraged questioning authority, and perhaps most importantly, a system that placed institutional image above individual safety. For survivors, the late acknowledgement felt bittersweet. Vindication came years after the harm. Many spoke of wishing they had been believed sooner, not just for their own healing, but to prevent others from suffering the same fate. The Robert Anderson case reshaped conversations across college campuses. Universities nationwide began reviewing medical oversight, complaint reporting systems, and safeguards designed to protect students. Policies changed, training increased. But for those affected, reform arrived long after the damage was done. In Michigan, this was no longer just a scandal, it was a reckoning. A reminder that abuse does not require secrecy to survive, only indifference. And as survivors continue to speak, their stories serve as warnings etched into the institution's history. Not to destroy it, but to force it to confront what it allowed to happen. Because when trust is broken inside places meant to protect, the consequences echo far beyond a single lifetime. For years, investigators believed the horror was contained within a single city, a single house, a single zip code. But the deeper authorities dug, the more unsettling the truth became. Some crimes do not respect borders, and when systems fail to communicate, predators move freely. At the center of this failure stood Anthony Sowell. Sowell would later be known as one of the most prolific serial killers in modern American history. His crimes were eventually uncovered in Cleveland, Ohio, but fragments of his trail reached beyond state lines, including Michigan, exposing how easily warning signs can be missed when jurisdictions operate in isolation. Sowell was a man who lived in plain sight, a former U.S. Marine, a registered sex offender, a figure familiar to law enforcement. Long before his arrest, his name had already appeared in police databases, court records, and community complaints. And yet, he remained free. Between the late 1992 and 2009, multiple women connected to Michigan through residency, family ties, or prior movements disappeared after drifting between cities in the Midwest. Some were last known to have traveled through or lived temporarily in Michigan before losing contact with loved ones. Their disappearances were often classified as runaways, transient cases, or low-priority missing persons reports. Each case, viewed alone, seemed incomplete, but together, they formed a pattern, no single agency fully assembled in time. Sowell targeted women on the margins of society. Many were struggling with addiction, housing instability, or mental health challenges. This made their disappearances easier to overlook and harder to track across state lines. When families in Michigan reported loved ones missing, they were often told there was little evidence of foul play. Meanwhile, Sowell continued moving between cities, exploiting the gaps between jurisdictions. The warning signs were there. In 2005, Sowell was convicted of attempted rape. The victim had escaped and reported the assault. He was sentenced to prison but served less time than expected. When he was released, oversight was minimal. His movements were not closely monitored. Information about his past did not trigger heightened interagency alerts. This is where the system failed. There was no comprehensive mechanism ensuring that reports from Michigan, Ohio, and neighboring states were actively compared. Missing persons databases were fragmented. Police departments relied on limited communication unless a case crossed a threshold of public pressure or evidence. As a result, disappearances that should have raised red flags remained disconnected. In 2009, everything changed. Authorities entered Sowell's home in Cleveland after reports of a foul odor and concerns raised by neighbors. What they discovered defied comprehension. Multiple bodies were found hidden throughout the house, some buried, some concealed in crawl spaces, others stored in sealed containers. The scale of the crimes stunned the nation. As investigators worked to identify the victims, the true extent of Sowell's reach began to surface. Several victims had ties beyond Ohio. Some had last been seen in other states. For Michigan families, this meant the worst possible confirmation. Loved ones long missing might have met violent ends far from home. DNA analysis and forensic identification connected victims across regions. For families who had spent years searching, hope gave way to grief. Questions followed not only about Sowell, but about the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Why weren't these disappearances connected sooner? Why wasn't Sowell more closely monitored after prior convictions? Why did geography matter more than patterns? For Michigan, the case was particularly unsettling. It revealed how easily a predator could operate when victims crossed state lines. It showed how missing persons reports filed in one state could remain invisible to investigators in another. And it highlighted how societal bias, particularly toward marginalized women, contributed to delayed responses. Sowell was eventually convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. He died in prison in 2021. His punishment closed the chapter on his life, but not on the systemic failures that allowed him to kill for so long. The families left behind were forced to confront a bitter truth. Their loved ones did not disappear because no one cared. They disappeared because too many systems operated independently, without urgency, and without coordination. In Michigan, law enforcement agencies began reevaluating how they handled missing persons cases involving travel or relocation. Information sharing improved, databases were expanded, but these changes came after irreversible loss. This case is not remembered solely for its brutality, it is remembered as a warning that predators thrive where attention is divided, a warning that jurisdictional boundaries can become blindfolds, and a warning that when victims are overlooked, killers gain time. Anthony Sowell did not rely on invisibility, he relied on disconnection, and for Michigan families searching for answers, the cost of that disconnection was immeasurable. Some crimes begin with violence, others begin with words. In this case, the damage started long before the murder, inside a carefully constructed web of manipulation, control, and psychological domination. And at the center of that web was Aubrey Trail. Trail did not look like a cult leader in the traditional sense. He did not command large gatherings or preach to crowds. Instead, he operated quietly, targeting individuals who were vulnerable, isolated, or searching for belonging. His power came not from numbers, but from control. He convinced those around him that he was a mentor, a protector, someone who understood them when no one else did. In reality, he was building a private world where rules only applied if he decided they did. Trail and his partner created an environment defined by obedience and fear. Victims were slowly stripped of independence financially, emotionally, psychologically. Every decision was monitored. Every doubt was punished. What began as persuasion gradually turned into coercion. By the time violence entered the picture, resistance had already been broken. The murder itself shocked Michigan not only for its brutality, but for what it revealed about how easily manipulation can escalate into lethal control. The victim had been isolated, conditioned to obey, and made to believe escape was impossible. This was not a crime of sudden rage. It was a crime built piece by piece. Investigators later uncovered evidence of prolonged abuse, not just physical, but psychological. Communications showed how Trail reinforced loyalty while simultaneously instilling fear. He used threats, promises, and humiliation interchangeably, depending on what maintained dominance. Those under his influence were made to feel complicit, dependent, trapped. When the body was discovered, the investigation quickly uncovered the disturbing dynamic behind the crime. Authorities realized this was not a simple homicide. It was the culmination of long-term manipulation resembling cult behavior, small in scale, but devastating in impact. Michigan residents struggled to understand how something like this could happen without outside intervention. But experts pointed to a familiar pattern. Coercive control often hides in plain sight. Victims may appear compliant. They may defend their abuser. They may cut off friends and family, not because they want to, but because they believe they must. Trail exploited that silence. During trial, prosecutors laid out a chilling narrative. They described how authority was asserted through fear, how dissent was crushed, and how violence became inevitable once control was threatened. Witnesses testified about intimidation, emotional abuse, and an atmosphere where obedience was enforced at all costs. The courtroom became a window into a closed world few had known existed. For Michigan, the case raised uncomfortable questions. How many abusive dynamics remain hidden because they don't fit traditional definitions? How many victims are controlled not by chains, but by belief? Trail was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The verdict brought legal closure, but it did not undo the psychological damage inflicted long before the murder occurred. This case stands out because it blurs the line between domestic abuse, cult behavior, and homicide. It shows how power can be weaponized quietly without crowds, without ideology, without spectacle, until the consequences become irreversible. Unlike other crimes that erupt suddenly, this one unfolded slowly. Each act of control made the next easier. Each boundary crossed made violence more likely. For viewers, it is a reminder that cult-like abuse does not always wear obvious disguises. Sometimes, it exists inside small relationships, private spaces, controlled environments where one voice is allowed to dominate all others. In Michigan, this case remains a warning about coercive control, a form of abuse that often goes unrecognized until it turns deadly. Because when someone controls how you think, they eventually decide how far they're allowed to go. And in this case, that distance ended in murder. Some cases refuse to settle into certainty. They linger in courtrooms, in public opinion, and in the minds of those who follow them. This was one of those cases, a story where the evidence was circumstantial, the emotions were raw, and the truth seemed permanently divided. At the center stood Christopher Porco. In 2004, a quiet suburban home was shattered by violence. Peter Porco, a respected professional, was found dead after being brutally attacked with an axe. His wife, Joan Porco, survived the assault despite catastrophic injuries. The attack occurred while the couple slept, turning their own bedroom into a crime scene. From the beginning, investigators focused on the family's son. Christopher Porco was a college student at the time, struggling financially and academically. Evidence suggested he had been deceptive about his status at school and was facing increasing pressure from his parents. Prosecutors would later argue that this pressure formed a motive, that fear of exposure drove him to violence. But motive alone was not enough. The case hinged on circumstantial evidence. No eyewitnesses placed Christopher at the scene. No blood-stained clothing was recovered. The murder weapon was never definitively traced to him. What prosecutors presented instead was a timeline built from travel records, computer activity, and behavior after the crime. They argued Christopher had driven hours overnight, committed the attack, and returned to campus before morning, a narrow window that, while possible, left little room for error. The most controversial aspect of the case came from Joan Porco herself. Despite surviving the attack, Joan repeatedly stated that she did not believe her son was responsible. Even after suffering severe head injuries that affected her memory, she maintained her position, standing by Christopher during the trial and beyond. To the prosecution, this loyalty was seen as denial, perhaps influenced by trauma or maternal instinct. To the defense, it was powerful testimony undermining the state's narrative. The jury listened to both sides. They heard about forged documents, credit card usage, and strained family dynamics. They heard about computer records suggesting activity that contradicted Christopher's alibi. They also heard about the lack of direct evidence, the absence of forensic proof tying him conclusively to the attack. After deliberation, the jury found Christopher Porco guilty of murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to decades in prison, but the verdict did not bring closure. Public opinion remained deeply divided. Supporters of the conviction argued that the circumstantial evidence formed a compelling pattern. Critics pointed to the unanswered questions, the missing weapon, the tight timeline, the surviving victim's insistence on her son's innocence. For Michigan, the case became emblematic of a broader debate. How much certainty is enough to convict? Can patterns replace proof? And how do juries weigh emotion against logic when family loyalty collides with violent crime? Years later, appeals were filed and denied. Christopher Porco remained incarcerated. Joan Porco continued to advocate for her son, standing by him even as time passed and public interest faded. The case left behind no clean resolution, only fragments of evidence, of belief, of doubt. Unlike crimes driven by clear malice or unmistakable brutality, this case unsettled people because it lived in gray space. It forced observers to confront uncomfortable realities, that families can fracture in unimaginable ways, and that truth in the justice system is sometimes assembled rather than witnessed. For some, the conviction represented accountability. For others, it represented a failure to reach certainty. And that is why this case still resonates. Not because everyone agrees on what happened, but because no matter where you stand, something about the story never quite feels complete. In Michigan's criminal history, this remains one of the most controversial family murder cases ever tried. A reminder that justice does not always arrive with clarity, and that some verdicts leave questions echoing long after the courtroom doors close. On a cold night in February, the city of Kalamazoo, Michigan, slipped into fear without warning. There was no single crime scene, no clear motive, no obvious connection between victims. What unfolded instead was chaos, violence moving through the city in real time. At the center of it all was Jason Dalton. Dalton was a quiet man, a factory worker, a husband, a father. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared ordinary, even unremarkable. That normalcy would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Because on that night, while logged into the Uber app, Jason Dalton began shooting strangers. The attacks came without pattern. A woman was shot outside her apartment complex. A father and his teenage son were gunned down in a parking lot. A group of people was targeted at a restaurant, leaving multiple victims dead. The shootings occurred across different locations, separated by time and distance, making it difficult for police to immediately understand what they were dealing with. For residents, confusion turned into panic. Police dispatchers received fragmented reports. Officers raced from one scene to another, unsure if they were chasing one suspect or many. Social media filled with warnings. Parents rushed to pick up children. Businesses locked their doors. And all the while, Dalton continued driving. Between shootings, he picked up passengers. Some later described nothing unusual, no threats, no visible distress. Others would realize only later how close they had come to becoming victims. The randomness was terrifying. Investigators later learned that Dalton claimed he believed he was being controlled by the Uber app. He described hallucinations, saying the app had transformed into a demonic symbol and was directing him to kill. Whether this belief was genuine delusion or an attempt to explain his actions became a central issue in the case. When police finally identified Dalton as the suspect, they launched a citywide search. He was arrested without incident after being stopped in his vehicle. Inside, officers found a handgun and ammunition. The killing stopped as abruptly as it had begun. In total, 6 people were killed and 2 others seriously injured. None had any known connection to Dalton. There was no robbery, no personal grievance, no warning signs that anyone could point to in hindsight. For Michigan, the case struck at a deep fear, violence without reason. The trial focused heavily on Dalton's mental state. Defense attorneys argued that he was experiencing severe psychosis and could not distinguish reality from delusion. Prosecutors countered that despite his claims, Dalton demonstrated planning, awareness, and control, switching weapons, choosing locations, and attempting to avoid detection. Jurors were faced with a difficult question: where does mental illness end and responsibility begin? They heard testimony from mental health experts, law enforcement officers, and survivors. They saw surveillance footage. They listened to Dalton's own statements. Ultimately, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Jason Dalton was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought legal closure, but not emotional resolution. For the city of Kalamazoo, the scars remained. Residents spoke of lingering anxiety, of checking over their shoulders in parking lots, of the unsettling knowledge that violence had arrived without warning or explanation. The case also sparked broader conversations about rideshare safety, mental health screening, and how platforms respond when drivers are involved in violent crime. Uber revised certain policies, but critics argued that systemic safeguards were still insufficient. More than anything, the case forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth: not all violence announces itself. Sometimes, it arrives behind the wheel of a familiar car, wearing the face of someone you would never suspect. In Michigan's criminal history, the Kalamazoo Uber shootings remain one of the most disturbing examples of randomness and fear, not because of how it ended but because of how easily it began. No arguments, no warning, just a man driving through the night, deciding who would live and who would die. Some deaths are ruled accidents so quickly that no one thinks to question them. This was one of those cases until time, persistence, and evidence forced the truth back into the light. At the center was William Millard, the son of Canadian billionaire Robert Millard, founder of a successful technology empire. William grew up surrounded by privilege, wealth, and opportunity. Yet despite the advantages, his life was marked by personal struggles that would later shape how authorities interpreted his death. In 2016, William was found dead in a garage in Michigan. A hose connected the car's exhaust to the interior. The initial conclusion was swift: accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. Case closed. To many, the explanation made sense. William had battled addiction and mental health challenges in the past. Tragedy, it seemed, had simply followed a familiar path. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious struggle, no immediate reason to suspect foul play. But for his family, something felt wrong. Subtle inconsistencies began to surface, details that didn't align, questions that were brushed aside too easily. As time passed, doubts grew, not just emotional doubts, but factual ones. Why were certain items in the garage moved? Why did aspects of the scene suggest staging rather than accident? Why had the investigation ended so quickly? Pressure mounted for a deeper review. Eventually, Authorities reopened the case. A second look at the evidence revealed a far more troubling picture. Forensic analysis suggested the scene may have been manipulated. The positioning of the hose, the timing of events, and digital records began to challenge the original ruling. The narrative shifted from accident to homicide. Investigators uncovered evidence pointing toward individuals close to William, people with access, opportunity, and potential motives tied to control and money. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident now looked increasingly like a calculated act. As the investigation unfolded, Michigan watched as the story transformed in real time. The case highlighted a recurring problem in high-profile deaths. Assumptions based on wealth, status, or personal history can shape conclusions before evidence is fully examined. Charges were eventually brought against suspects connected to William's inner circle. Prosecutors alleged that the death was staged to look accidental, exploiting William's past struggles to deflect suspicion. The legal proceedings revealed layers of deception, conflicting statements, and a timeline that no longer held together. For the Millard family, the reopening of the case was both devastating and validating. It confirmed their worst fears but also proved that persistence mattered. That initial conclusions, once questioned, could be overturned. The trial exposed the fragility of first impressions in criminal investigations. Jurors heard how quickly authorities had accepted the accidental death narrative, and how long it took for critical evidence to receive proper scrutiny. They saw how privilege can sometimes shield wrongdoing, not intentionally, but through assumptions and shortcuts. In Michigan, the case became a cautionary tale. A reminder that no death should be dismissed too easily. That mental health history should not become a convenient explanation, and that wealth does not eliminate the possibility of violence within families or close relationships. William Millard's death reshaped how the public viewed accidental rulings, especially in cases involving power and money. It forced investigators to confront uncomfortable questions about bias, speed, and thoroughness. Most haunting of all was the realization that had his family not insisted on answers, the truth might never have surfaced. This case stands as proof that justice sometimes requires defiance, the willingness to challenge official conclusions and demand more than convenience. Because in the end, William Millard did not die by accident. He was killed, and only time, scrutiny, and refusal to accept silence brought that truth into the open. In Detroit, violence is often framed as something that happens outside the home, on streets, in alleys, between strangers. This case shattered that assumption. Because the danger did not come from outside, it came from within. At the center of this tragedy was Devin Davenport. To neighbors, the family appeared ordinary, no public history of chaos, no constant police presence. From the outside, it looked like just another household trying to survive in a struggling city. But inside the walls, pressure had been building quietly. Family annihilation rarely announces itself. It grows in silence through financial strain, emotional isolation, untreated mental health issues, and unresolved conflict. By the time violence erupts, the warning signs often seem obvious only in hindsight. Investigators later pieced together a pattern of stress surrounding Devin Davenport's life. Economic instability, relationship tension, a sense of losing control. Those closest to him would later describe a man who felt cornered, overwhelmed by expectations he could no longer meet. Instead of seeking help, he withdrew. On the day of the killings, the violence was swift and devastating. Multiple members of the same family were found dead inside their home. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an outside intruder. The scene told a grim story. This was not random violence. It was intentional. Police quickly focused on Davenport. The evidence pointed inward towards someone who knew the home, the routines, and the victims intimately. The brutality of the act stunned even seasoned investigators. Family annihilation cases are among the most psychologically disturbing because they defy one of society's most basic assumptions, that family equals safety. Detroit residents reacted with shock and disbelief. Many struggled to reconcile the image of a family man with the reality of mass murder. Friends and neighbors spoke of moments that now felt ominous: arguments overheard, emotional distance, sudden changes in behavior. But no one had imagined this outcome. As the investigation unfolded, authorities emphasized that this was not a crime driven by sudden rage alone. It was the result of prolonged psychological breakdown, a sense of failure. A belief, however, distorted that violence was the only escape. Experts note that in many family annihilation cases, perpetrators perceive themselves as victims of circumstance. They view their actions not as cruelty, but as control, a final, destructive attempt to reclaim power over a life they believe has slipped away. This case fit that pattern. For Michigan, the tragedy raised difficult questions about how such violence can remain invisible until it is too late. How many families are struggling behind closed doors? How many warning signs go unnoticed because they don't fit stereotypes of danger? The aftermath was devastating. Extended family members were left to grieve multiple losses at once. Children were orphaned. Communities were forced to confront the reality that violence can exist quietly, even in homes that appear stable. Unlike high-profile shootings or gang-related crimes, family annihilation leaves no external enemy to blame. The horror is deeply personal. It forces society to examine uncomfortable truths about mental health, masculinity, economic pressure, and emotional isolation. In Detroit, a city already burdened by hardship, this case cut especially deep. It reminded residents that survival stress does not only manifest on the streets, it seeps into living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms. The legal proceedings that followed focused on accountability, but they could not offer answers to the deeper why. Why did no one intervene sooner? Why were the signs not recognized as cries for help? And why do these tragedies often seem inevitable only after they occur? This case stands as one of Michigan's most haunting family crimes, not because of its scale alone, but because of its intimacy. Violence carried out not against strangers, but against those bound by blood and trust. Family annihilation leaves no winners, only silence, empty rooms, and questions that linger long after the headlines fade. In Detroit, this tragedy remains a stark reminder. The most dangerous breakdowns are sometimes the ones happening quietly, out of sight, until they explode. For years, the file sat untouched. No suspect, no arrest, just a name on a folder and a family waiting for answers. This was the kind of case that quietly slips into history, not because it mattered less, but because time made it harder to solve. That was the fate of the murder of Brandon Scott. When Brandon was killed, the investigation began with urgency. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed witnesses, and followed every lead they could find, but evidence was limited. The scene yielded little more than fragments, not enough to point to a clear suspect. As weeks turned into months, the trail went cold. And then, it stopped entirely. For Brandon's family, time did not heal anything, it only stretched the pain. Birthdays passed, holidays arrived and left. Each year, without answers, felt like a quiet injustice layered on top of the original crime. In Michigan, cold cases like this are not rare. They are the result of limited technology, limited resources, and the harsh reality that not every crime can be solved with the tools available at the time. In Brandon's case, investigators preserved what evidence they could, hoping that one day science might catch up. Years later, it did. Advancements in DNA analysis transformed criminal investigations across the country. Techniques that once required large, pristine samples could now work with trace evidence, degraded, incomplete, or decades old. What once meant nothing suddenly meant everything. Detectives reopened Brandon Scott's case. Evidence collected long ago was sent for modern DNA testing. The results produced a profile, not a name, not a face, but a genetic fingerprint. From there, investigators turned to genealogical databases, mapping family trees, tracing distant relatives, and slowly narrowing the field. This was patient work, methodical, quiet. Eventually, the DNA led them to a suspect who had lived freely for years, never publicly connected to the crime. Someone who had blended back into ordinary life, believing the past was buried. It wasn't. When authorities made the arrest, the announcement rippled through Michigan. A case once thought unsolvable had finally been cracked, not by confession, not by witness testimony, but by science and persistence. For Brandon's family, the moment brought conflicting emotions. Relief that the truth had surfaced, anger that it took so long, grief that no amount of justice could return what was lost. In court, prosecutors laid out the genetic evidence. The defense challenged the methods, questioning the reliability of genealogical DNA and the ethics of using public databases. The jury listened as experts explained how probabilities, markers, and lineage tracing could identify a suspect with extraordinary accuracy. This case was not just about one murder. It became part of a broader conversation about modern policing. Supporters saw DNA technology as a powerful equalizer, a way to bring justice to victims long ignored by time. Critics raised concerns about privacy, oversight, and the potential for misuse. Michigan, like many states, found itself at the center of that debate. But for the family, the question was simpler. Did it bring answers? The conviction did not erase years of waiting. It did not undo the trauma. But it did something critical. It acknowledged that Brandon Scott's life mattered enough to keep searching, even decades later. Cold cases often carry a cruel assumption that time erases responsibility. This case shattered that belief. It proved that even when suspects think they've escaped consequences, the evidence remembers. In Michigan, law enforcement agencies began reviewing other unsolved cases, re-examining old evidence through a modern lens. Files were reopened. DNA was retested. Names once forgotten were spoken again. Brandon Scott's case became a symbol not of delayed justice, but of justice refusing to die. For families of cold case victims, it offered a fragile kind of hope. A reminder that silence does not always mean surrender, that progress can arrive quietly, long after the headlines fade. This case also served as a warning. Time is not protection. Obscurity is not safety. And the past, when preserved carefully, has a way of catching up. Brandon Scott did not get justice quickly, but he got it eventually. And in the world of true crime, that matters. Some murders do not hide in darkness. They hide in plain sight behind routines, families, and decades of normal life. This was one of them. For more than 30 years, the disappearance of a teenage girl remained an open wound. No body, no suspect, no answers. Just a family trapped in uncertainty, forced to live between hope and grief. The man responsible was Dennis Bowman. In the late 1980 seconds, a teenage girl vanished without explanation. She left behind questions that echoed through Michigan for decades. Investigators searched, leads were followed, posters were printed, but time passed, and the case slowly drifted into the category no family wants to hear, unresolved. What no one knew was that the truth had never left Michigan. It was living quietly inside the life of a man who had blended in perfectly. Dennis Bowman was not a fugitive. He did not flee the state. He did not change his name. He built a family, held jobs, became a husband and a father. To neighbors and coworkers, he was ordinary, unremarkable, in the way that allows people to disappear into society. But beneath that normalcy, Bowman carried a secret. For years, he lived with the knowledge that the girl everyone was searching for was already gone and that he was the reason. He had hidden her remains so thoroughly that even time itself seemed to give up. The case remained cold not because investigators stopped caring, but because there was nothing left to chase. Until Bowman himself broke the silence. Decades after the disappearance, Bowman contacted authorities. What he told them stunned investigators. He confessed to killing the missing teen and revealed where her remains could be found. The location he described confirmed what many had feared but never proven. The mystery was never unsolved. It was concealed. When police recovered the remains, the family finally received the truth they had been denied for most of their lives. Closure came not with relief, but with grief sharpened by time. The hope they had carried for decades collapsed into a single, devastating certainty. Bowman was arrested and charged. In court, prosecutors outlined how he had managed to evade suspicion for so long. There had been no dramatic cover-up, no elaborate deception. Just silence and a society that had no reason to look at him twice. The confession raised haunting questions. Why now? What made Bowman speak after so many years? Some speculated guilt. Others pointed to fear of exposure as technology advanced. Perhaps Bowman realized that DNA, witness memories, or chance discoveries would eventually uncover the truth. Or perhaps he simply grew tired of carrying it. For Michigan, this case struck deeply because it exposed one of the most unsettling realities of true crime. Some killers are not caught, they are waited out. The justice system did not defeat Bowman through investigation. He surrendered himself to it on his own timeline. After decades of freedom, the sentencing brought legal resolution, but it also exposed the cruel imbalance of time. Bowman had lived a full adult life. The victim had been denied even the chance to grow old. Her family had waited more than 30 years for a truth that arrived far too late. This case became a symbol of delayed justice and of how disappearance cases linger far beyond police files. They live inside families, inside unanswered questions, inside years stolen by uncertainty. In Michigan's criminal history, Dennis Bowman's case is remembered not just for the crime, but for the silence that followed it. A silence that lasted longer than many prison sentences. It is a reminder that closure delayed is still closure, but it comes at a devastating cost. Some secrets are not uncovered by detectives. Some are carried to the end of a life, and some only surface when the person hiding them decides it is time. For one Michigan family, the truth arrived decades too late, but it arrived. Michigan is often remembered for its lakes, its industry, and its resilience. But beneath that identity lies a darker history, one shaped not just by crime, but by silence, failure, and delayed truth. These 10 cases were not connected by a single killer or a single motive. They were connected by something far more unsettling: how long each one was allowed to exist before it was confronted. In some cases, the warning signs were clear. Victims spoke up, families raised concerns, red flags were documented, and still, nothing happened. Institutions chose reputation over responsibility. Systems designed to protect instead looked away. Authority went unquestioned, and trust became a shield for abuse. In other cases, the danger came without warning. Violence erupted suddenly, random, unpredictable, leaving communities terrified and searching for meaning where none seemed to exist. Ordinary routines were shattered, proving that safety is often an assumption, not a guarantee. There were crimes driven by power, crimes fueled by control, crimes hidden behind wealth, education, or normalcy. And then there were the cases that waited quietly, cold files gathering dust while families carried grief for decades. Justice did not arrive because the system was relentless. It arrived because time, technology, or a confession finally forced the truth into the open. Michigan's criminal history shows us something uncomfortable. Crime does not always thrive in darkness. It often survives in daylight, protected by disbelief, indifference, and delay. The victims in these stories were not statistics. They were athletes who trusted doctors, students who trusted institutions, families who trusted each other, people who believed the world around them was safer than it truly was. What makes these cases disturbing is not only what happened, but how long it took to stop it. This series is not about fear, it is about awareness. About understanding that justice is fragile, and accountability must be demanded, not assumed. Because when silence is allowed to grow, it becomes a partner to crime. Michigan learned that lesson at an enormous cost. And as long as these stories are remembered, they serve one final purpose: to remind us that ignoring the warning signs is often the most dangerous decision of all. Some truths arrive too late, but they still matter.